Good evening, class. Welcome again to Mr. Martyr and Mr. Walters' Flip Classroom. This is video 3, Imperialism in Africa.
All right, class, here we go. So, this is the Africa edition. We'll start off with Mr. Martin explaining why Africa. Or was I supposed to explain this one?
I'm going to let Mr. Walter take the lead.
Okay, so prior to the year 1800, class, in Africa, a lot was going on in the interior, but Europeans really didn't know about it. Europeans had primarily dealt with Africa on the coast, and they really hadn't gone into Africa. And the person that changes this, and you're going to want to write these two names down, is a man by the name of Dr. David Livingstone and British journalist Henry M. Stanley. And these two gentlemen travel in Africa, they write about their findings, and they publish their findings. And when they do that, a lot of Europeans suddenly become very interested on what's going on inside of Africa.
Alrighty, so the Scramble of Africa. A couple videos ago, I made reference to Africa being kind of like a Thanksgiving turkey that gets all carved up. Well, that happens in the 1880s. As countries begin to invest in Africa and go into Africa, they really begin to stake their claims. And in 1885, 14 European countries meet in Berlin in what's called the Berlin Conference. I would make sure you star, highlight, or underline that phrase. It's going to be very, very important. At the Berlin Conference, led by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the Germans divide up, take the lead, and divide up Africa. Now, it's important to know who is missing at this Berlin Conference. Well, that's right. There's not one representative from any of the African nations. It's all the European countries dividing up land that rightfully isn't theirs. By 1914, guys, 90% of the entire African continent was controlled by Europe.
Okay, class. So, essentially, this is, I just want to do a quick little map to show you kind of what Europeans' perception of Africa was. So, in the early 1300s, the 1490s, you can see they have the general outline of Africa because, if you remember, there was navigation, and so they got the coastline down pretty well. But inside Africa, you can see it's pretty much blank. By 1600 to 1700, they have a little bit better of an idea of what's going on inside of Africa. And I'm just going to flip through this a little bit. You can start to see where Europeans start laying claims to Africa. The different colors are regions that are owned by different European countries. And if you notice this map right here is what I really wanted to show you. You notice how the middle map shows the different countries that take over parts of Africa, and that will eventually lead to why the African countries look the way they do today. And as Mr. Marner wants to point out, certain African countries speak European languages.
Yeah, for example, they speak French in Algeria. South Africa is predominantly British. They speak English.
They speak English.
And I think in Mauritania they also speak French, and they speak English in Egypt, and even in Sudan, which used to be a heavily occupied British territory.
Yep. Okay. So, again, when we study Africa, we split it up into the north, south, central, east, and west regions. And so we're going to start with North Africa.
All right, North Africa. Most of the European control is taken by in North Africa. Most North Africa is obviously that great big desert called the Sahara, it is the largest desert in the world. People live along that strip of land bordering the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, this has been some of the most conquered part of Africa in its history. The Romans did it, the Greeks did it, the Carthaginians did it. The French will take over, and they will take the area of Algeria, seen right here, and Morocco, seen here. All right. Great Britain, on the other hand, in 1869, they take a hold of the Suez Canal in the Egyptian region. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Suez Canal in a later episode. But the British use that as their pipeline to get quick access to India.
Okay. In West Africa, the Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French all set up trading posts, and starting in around the year 1870, they start to push inward and take over more land. I just want to make a mention of this one little country on the west coast of Africa Liberia. That Liberia will become a free country, and it's actually founded by American slaves. And it is still there today, and we have very close ties to this country.
And if I can, the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, the only capital to have to be named after a U.S. president, James Monroe.
For Mr. Martin's sake, we may put that as a test question on tomorrow's quiz. Monrovia. All right.
All right, East Africa. If you guys have played Medal of Honor or Call of Duty, or you've seen the movie Black Hawk Down, that takes place in the country of Somalia, right here on the east coast of Africa. The country of Kenya located here, Ethiopia, and if you guys have heard of the genocide in Darfur, that takes place in the Sudan. All of these are byproducts of imperialism. All right, but in East Africa, for our class discussion, King Leopold II of Belgium seizes control of the Congo from 1878 onward, and he will eventually give the Congo its freedom in 1908. Ethiopia marks one of the
Sorry, hold on there.
Ethiopia marks one of the first times a free country is ruled by Menelik II.
Ethiopia remains free. In South Africa, the colony of Cape Town is founded by the Dutch. At the time, they were known as Afrikaneers, and the British and the Dutch will go to war over this area in 1902, called the Boer War. And essentially, what you need to know is that the British win the war, and they take over South Africa.
Now, Mr. Walter, do you know how the British won the Boer War? What was one military advantage they had over the Dutch?
No, Mr. Martin, what's that?
Well, it's a simple invention, and that is barbed wire. The British began using the idea of barbed wire for their defenses. We're going to talk a lot about barbed wire and its impact in World War I in the next unit, but barbed wire, very interesting little factoid there.
Oh, very good. And the last mention on this here is the Dutch, because they don't have the outer regions of South Africa, they're going to move inland, and this is known as the Great Trek, and they will end up fighting with a local tribe known as the Zulus. And the Zulus at this time will be led by a man named Shaka Zulu, which means heavenly beetle.
Interesting.
Because I can speak a little bit of Zulu. All right. And the British win overall. Okay. Essentially, the big picture here is, with colonization of Africa and imperialism, is that the Europeans are going to prosper. They're going to take the best land. They're going to take the best resources, and they're going to ship all of this out of Africa, and the Africans themselves are going to suffer.
Alrighty, guys. Make sure you get all this down in video 3, the Scramble for Africa, on your Cornell note packets. Look at this material. Study for your quiz tomorrow in class.
Got it.